The American Revolution did not just happen. It was not inevitable. In fact, on the eve of the conflict, an attempt was made to sustain peace. A series of events had to lead the colonists to this bloody war, which is what we're going to look at. The colonists reacted to the acts and taxes imposed on them in various ways. One example was tar and feathering. The colonists, especially those in the port cities, would use pine tar, which was liquid at room temperature, and feathers to humiliate customs officials as they were paraded around the city. The port cities had an abundance of pine tar as it was used to waterproof ships. So as you can see in the political cartoon, the customs agent is also being forced to drink tea, an affront to the Tea Act, no doubt. The colonists also formed committees of correspondence. The goals were to warn neighboring colonies about incidents with the British and to broaden the resistance movement. The colonists attempted and were successful at passing information using messenger riders like Paul Revere, as British occupation was seen throughout the colonies, along with naval and marine forces. Secrecy measures and the use of codes were necessary to unite the colonies and prepare for possible military actions. Remember, the colonists thrived during the period of salutary neglect and are not willing to lose that way of life. The purpose of the British soldiers' presence was to enforce customs collection. The port cities were known for smuggling. The Gaspee was a British ship that was chased and run aground by the Hannah. The intention of the Gaspee was to uphold the Navigation Acts. The Rhode Island chapter of the Sons of Liberty boarded the Gaspee and burned the vessel. The captain was shot but not killed. The men involved were tried for treason, but not enough evidence was found to convict. The importance of this incident was not the incident itself. These types of acts happened frequently. What made this incident important was the local minister, John Allen, who gave and published a sermon noting the greedy nature of the monarch, the corrupt judges that let the British soldiers do whatever they pleased with no consideration of English rights, and the conspiracies of Parliament to impose taxes in order to raise their own salaries. Allen's sermon was passed up and down the colonies, creating increased awareness and the need to fight back. The British East India Tea Company was struggling, and with many members of Parliament holding shares, the decision was made to create a monopoly on British tea imports. Eliminating competitive tea imports would increase revenue, thus putting more money into the pockets of Parliament. Parliament thought they could trick the Americans into accepting taxation. The British expected the colonists would be happy. After all, the tax on the monopolized tea actually made the tea cheaper in price. The committees of correspondence, however, did not agree. They stopped the tea shipments from docking in ports up and down the coast. Once the tea ships pulled into the harbor and docked, the taxes would have to be paid. So on November 28, 1773, a tea ship landed in Boston Harbor, evading the colonists' deterrence, and the duties had to be paid. Sam Adams called a meeting. 50 men dressed as Indians threw the tea into the harbor. Be aware, Sam Adams and the Sons of Liberty did not think they fooled the British with their Indian costumes. Also, the picture that you see here would be inaccurate. The act happened at night and there was no onlookers cheering the men on. What is true about the incident is the reaction by Parliament. Parliament imposed the Intolerable Acts and British soldiers' presence increased. As you know from your research, the Intolerable Acts named by Parliament as the Coercive Acts were the acts that increased support for the movement toward the Declaration of Independence and the war. The Coercive Acts affected Boston the most. The Port Bill closed Boston's port until the tea that was damaged was paid for, thus crippling Boston's economy. The Massachusetts Government Act made Massachusetts colonial government less democratic and brought its charter under the control of the British Parliament. It limited the use of town meetings and censored anything discussed at the meetings. The new Quartering Act forced the Bostonians to house and feed troops even more so than was required before. Colonists were now required to use their economies to build barracks for the arrival of new soldiers. And the Administration of Justice Act tried those enforcing the royal law in England. Regardless of how the British soldiers and government officials squelched the colonists' English rights, the offenders would be tried in a British court. True justice was never received. In addition, Parliament passed the Quebec Act. This act allowed Quebec, a province of Britain won by the Paris of Peace Treaty, keep their official religion, allow their governors to maintain local power, and awarded land past the proclamation line. The key to this act was to gain favor in the peoples living in Canada for the good of the British Crown. The First Continental Congress met in order to decide how the colonists should respond to the Coercive and Quebec Act. 55 delegates met from 12 colonies. Georgia did not attend. One vote would be granted to each colony represented. At the end of the meeting, the following was agreed upon. 1, the colonists would continue to boycott British goods. 2, each colony would form a militia. 3, the 10 rights for colonists were drafted and agreed upon. The intent was to send this list to the king. It included no taxation without representation, no free trade, no illegal search and seizure, and to deconstruct the royal government put in place in most of the colonies, returning the colonial governments. And lastly, the committee agreed to meet again. As 1775 approached, it was becoming clearer that King George was lacking patience with the colonists and their response to acts and reorganization of colonial governments. Paul Revere and William Dawes were commissioned to make a midnight ride to warn the Minutemen of approaching British soldiers. The signal was decided upon. A lantern would be hung in the Old North Church, 1 if by land, 2 if by sea, as the British soldiers rode across the Charles River in Boston. That's the sea part. The goal of Revere was to warn Samuel Adams and John Hancock. Adams was a known activist in the movement, and Hancock was almost single-handedly funding the war effort in Boston. If the two men would have been caught, they would have been arrested and imprisoned. Now keep in mind, this is the assumption of the colonists. It's not necessarily true that the British were given this order. Concord, Massachusetts held the colonial arsenal, built by Adams and the Sons of Liberty over the past several years. It was believed that the British soldiers were on their way to confiscate the stockpile. Revere rode from Boston to Lexington. Revere was eventually arrested by the British patrol. On April 18, 1775, the war began between the United Kingdom of Britain and the 13 colonies in Middlesex County in Massachusetts. The goal of the British was to destroy the military supplies at Concord. The militia were outnumbered and fell back. The British regulars moved on to Concord. At the North Bridge, 500 militia fought and defeated 3 companies of the King's troops, which would probably be about 2,000 troops. The British soldiers fell back to Boston. The colonial militias were able to blockade access to Charlestown, forcing the British troops to remain in Boston. The British then seized and occupied Boston, where they remained until the end of the war. The Second Continental Congress met again, where they drafted the Olive Branch Petition. The petition made 3 demands: a ceasefire at Boston, the repeal of the Coercive Acts, and negotiations to establish American rights. The petition was sent across the Atlantic and was delayed in reaching the king. Upon reading the petition, King George responded as having no interest in peace at that point. The Continental Congress began to draft the Declaration of Independence. In order to gain support for the Declaration, Thomas Paine wrote Common Sense, a pamphlet written on a basic reading level in order to be read and well received by the masses. Paine took his inspiration from political thinker John Locke, who argued against a constitutional monarchy. Locke noted that if the power is divided between Parliament and the king will eventually take back more and more power. Limits in this type of government are insufficient and power will concentrate in the hands of the king. The focus of Common Sense was to note the best path is independence. Paine had three main themes. The first, the colonists needed to show confidence in their militias. After all, many of these men fought in the 7 Years' War and were successful. Secondly, they needed to fight against tyranny, which is clearly what is happening to the colonists at this point in time. And thirdly, they needed to reject the notion of a constitutional monarchy. If a monarch is dangerous, why would the colonists want to include a monarch in their government? Common Sense was used as the outline for the Declaration of Independence and brought a great deal of political debate and support. Okay, so the essential question here is for you to elaborate why the writing and signing of the Declaration of Independence was an act of treason. Make sure you're using evidence and please be specific.